It's pretty common to start out a course in a new subject or a subject that's new to you or new to the students to have the instructor explain what falls within the scope of the subject. For example, if you were first studying history, somebody might explain to you what history is. And that might have happened in high school, for the first history course, social studies course you took, that happened. But let's take a look at it. Notice I've put a little book up on the screen. It says Modern European History. Now, presumably, you know something about history, and my bet is if I asked you to sit down and write it down, and why don't you even do it? Write down what you would expect to find in that book entitled Modern European History. And really, sit down and write a few things down before I give you the answer, and stop and think about it. Okay, well, what came up on your list? What would you expect to see in there? Well, so you'd expect to see some stories about some events that occurred in the past in Europe. And we said modern, so you'd say maybe you'd expect to see something, since sort of the 1800s, maybe the French Revolution, maybe something even more modern, World War I and World War II. You'd expect to hear about wars, about formations of countries, that kind of things, though the events that happened and what caused them and how they caused subsequent events. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. I mean, to figure out what you'd find in a book like that, pretty clear, pretty straightforward. How about this one? The Elements of Nursing. Occasionally we have nursing students in here. Again, sit down, stop the recording a second and say, gee, what would I expect to find in that book? Well, now that you've written something down, I hope you can start it up again. If not, stop and don't go on. Think about it. Here are some of the things that kind of occur to me that you'd expect to see in a book, the Elements of Nursing. You might talk about, disease and healthcare and what nurses have to do in healthcare, what their role in healthcare is. You might see things about hospitals, about doctors' offices, about illnesses and how to treat illnesses, about procedures in particular areas. Maybe it's in surgery for surgical nurses. It might be things about dealing with people in the emergency room, dealing with people with broken bones, various other things. But I think we have a pretty good idea of what to expect inside a book called The Elements of Nursing. Let's look at another one. Law enforcement and criminal justice. Some of you are probably thinking about majoring in criminal justice, interested in careers in law and law enforcement. What would you expect to find in a book called Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice? And I'm serious about this. You'll make the most out of these videos if you stop and actually write down your answers to these questions. Well, what would you expect? What did you write down on your list now that you're starting the video up again? Maybe you'd write something down about the law. Sometimes people say something about the Constitution, in particular about criminal laws, about crimes, about the role of police procedures, the role of the courts, criminal procedures in the courts, the role of the cops there, the role of police in law enforcement, the role of the judge, the role of the government in general, how things change. So what's interesting is you have a really good idea of what to expect in any of these three books. But now you see a book Introduction to Philosophy. What is it that you expect to see in that book? Now I really want you to sit down. I'm going to put a discussion board up. I'd like you to answer the question on the discussion board. What do you expect to see in a philosophy book? What kinds of things, discussions of what subjects, what do you expect to be the outcome? So put it on hold and answer that discussion board, and let's come back to this. I think now that you've written down and you've taken your stand on what philosophy is and what it's about, I think you're beginning to see one of the difficulties that we encounter when we first enter the philosophy classroom, and that is to figure out exactly what the subject matter is. Sometimes people say, well, doesn't that have something to do with the mind and psychology? Well, it certainly has something to do with the mind, at least partially. But it isn't psychology. Psychology is its own separate science. So what did you put down? And now, if you haven't done it, seriously, go back and do that discussion board. Write your answer. What is philosophy? What do you expect to find in that Introduction to Philosophy book?